Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us here today for our monthly webinar series. You're here for the webinar titled From Access to Success, Exploring Post-Secondary Completion and Outcomes. My name is Tarin. I'm one of the knowledge and research leads here at the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health. If you have been to one of our webinars before, welcome back. If this is your first time, welcome. Happy to have you here. Before we begin, I do want to go over our land acknowledgement. So I know we join these sessions virtually, but we are joining in from ancestral lands from many Indigenous communities. And I am currently in Toronto, 13 territory, and the home of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat peoples, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the home of many people who may still be unrecorded. It is my duty to acknowledge the facts of colonialism that we still see today and identify the ways I may be participating in it and actively push back against it. So as we go through this webinar, I want you to think about how you might be able to support your Indigenous students and your colleagues in your role, and to promote a whole campus approach to health and wellness, and also be an active participant in the reconciliation process. So I always invite folks to check out CICMH's content regarding Indigenous mental health. My colleague Megan Van Every has been doing some fantastic work around identifying the needs of Indigenous students and staff. So I can put the link to that after I turn it over to the speakers, but please check those out. I will also go over some housekeeping. So you will find closed captioning available at the bottom of the screen. So feel free to turn that on. We also do have translated closed captions. So if you would like to see closed captioning in French, you can set the speaking language to English and then do the translated language to French, and you should see French closed captioning. The chat function is open for discussions in terms of thoughts or reactions. Please keep it respectful. And then we also have the Q&A functions for any questions you may have for our speakers. We will do Q&A at the very end, but if you have a burning question while the presentation is ongoing, feel free to put that in and we will get to that after. The recording will be available on our website after the webinar, usually by the end of the day. And yeah, any questions you might have, feel free to message me directly. Before we turn it over to our speakers, I do want to quickly do our pre-webinar poll. We just want to check in with folks about how they feel their knowledge is when it comes to the topic we're talking today. So I will launch the pre-webinar poll, and it's a quick one question. This is just, almost a way for you to reflect as well on how you think you may know about this. And we will do another poll at the end to see how you feel about your knowledge afterwards. And I will close the poll in 15 seconds. Okay, closing the poll. All right, so I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers here today. We're joined here by Dr. Ashley Pullman and Dr. Catherine Yee. They are from SRDC, but I will allow them to do a far more in-depth introduction of themselves. So over to you. I will stop sharing my screen though.
Thanks so much. Let me just start sharing my screen. Okay. We can see this all right?
Yes, we can.
Great. All right, let's get started. So I want to thank everyone for coming today to learn more about our research on post-secondary non-completion in Ontario. I wanted to actually begin the presentation by showing a picture of this sundial in the middle. It's actually from Hamilton Hall at McMaster University. And the inscription reads, my Latin is quite poor, but it reads something like out day, which has been translated in various ways, but essentially sets out to students rather bluntly, either you learn or you leave. And while there has been considerable research on persistence and retention while in school, our study takes a systems perspective to understand how common early leaving is, who is more likely to not graduate, what the earnings penalty is for non-completers, and how much it costs individuals, institutions, governments, and society. Before I get started on today's topic, I want to tell you a bit more about us. So SRDC is a nonprofit organization created over 3 decades ago to develop, field test, and evaluate new programs. We have a two-part mission. First, to help policymakers and practitioners identify policies and programs that improve well-being. And the second is to raise the standards of evidence that are used in assessing these policies and programs. And we typically do this through developing and testing interventions to learn what works. Many of these, such as the Future to Discover and Life After High School projects, have focused on increasing access to post-secondary, so really making sure students get into college and universities. Our organization also does a full range of research and evaluation work, including survey design, data analytics, various types of evaluations and consultations. And while Catherine and I are part of the education team, our colleague Nahid here is from the health team, and we'll speak a bit more about our experience supporting student mental health at the end. So today we're going to share findings from 2 projects on non-completion, specifically in Ontario. This work helps us understand not just how many students leave without completing, but also the broader social consequences. It set out to generate a really clear system-wide picture of non-completion in Ontario. We know that non-completion matters for well-being, future opportunities, and financial stability. But until this project, we didn't really know the extent of the issue, and the evidence that was there was quite fragmented, studying this in different ways. So the first part of the study involved studying non-completion for the entire Ontario system. We wanted to understand the scale of this issue. How many students are not completing? How does this vary across programs and groups? New data linkages allowed us to look at this much more closely. This level of granularity is essential for designing targeted supports, especially for student-facing staff who see firsthand how many students experience different barriers. Another component of this project was a cost-benefit analysis, and we looked at the cost of non-completion for multiple actors. This helped quantify the effect of non-completion and also help us show that supporting students has real economic implications. When we talk about non-completion, it's important to recognize that students leave for many reasons. Sometimes it's about program fit, sometimes family responsibility, sometimes financial pressure. It's also important to note that it's not always a wrong decision to leave a program. Parental or social pressure can land people in programs that they don't like. But research also shows that many of the factors influencing persistence are malleable. Things like motivation, academic skills, social integration, and a student's sense of belonging with a program or institution. These are areas where interventions can make a real difference, and they're also areas closely tied to mental health and well-being. There's a large body of research that has consistently found that high levels of stress, anxiety, depression, and substance use are associated with a greater likelihood of early leaving. They typically point to the same pattern. When mental health challenges increase, the risk of leaving early tends to increase as well. But we know that this relationship is not uniform. It varies across different student groups, different types of institutions and programs, and the level of social support available to an individual. For example, the impact of anxiety on persistence may look really different for a first-generation student studying in a high-intensity STEM program compared to a mature student studying in a part-time diploma program. For clinicians, this reinforces something they see every day. Mental health challenges don't occur in isolation. They interact with academic pressure, financial stress, identity development, and social context. To increase our evidence on non-completion, we understood that we first need to understand the scope and consequence of non-completion, and second, quantify the economic impacts. This establishes a clear, consistent definition of non-completion, something that's often different across institutions and data sets. When we measured non-completion across Ontario, we were looking also by differences by student characteristics and program type. We also compared what happens after students leave in terms of their employment and earnings. And what we found is that roughly 1 in 4 students, about 25%, did not earn a credential within 7 years of starting their schooling. And the consequences are significant. In the first year after leaving, non-completers were earning about 50% less than graduates. This gives us a baseline understanding of both the scale of non-completion and its immediate economic impacts on students. In phase 2 of the project, we broadened the analysis by adding a third comparison group. So these are individuals who didn't attend post-secondary at all. We then examined the net cost and benefits of non-completion for students, institutions, governments, and society. This included both direct costs, like lost tuition revenue or lower tax contributions, and indirect costs, like reduced lifetime earnings. On average, students who attend post-secondary, even if they don't complete, still see a financial benefit compared to not attending at all. But the financial difference between completers and non-completers is substantial. Graduates see an estimated lifetime financial benefit of about $380,000 more compared to non-completers. And this phase showed that completion has a major economic payoff, and non-completion carries real cost, not just for students, but the entire system. I'm now going to discuss the first phase of the project in greater detail, and then turn it over to my colleague, Catherine, to talk about the second phase. So first, I'm going to talk about the data we used, which comes from the Education and Labor Market Longitudinal Platform. And this platform allows researchers to securely access anonymized student information. A main component is the post-secondary student information system, which provides annual enrollment records from public colleges and universities across Canada. It details the range of programs a student may be enrolled in, as well as information on if and when they graduated. We also used the Registered Apprenticeship Information System to track someone who had started at a college or university, but then went on to complete an apprenticeship. We linked these data to the 2016 census to capture additional student information, as well as federal student loan application data to see if students accessed financial aid and information from their assessments. And finally, to examine labor market outcomes, we used information from the T1 family file, which provides data on annual income and earnings as declared through tax returns. Using these data, we began by defining non-completion. And for this project, as I've mentioned, we took a system-wide approach. Initial enrollment in the system was treated as a key event that started a window of time which we observed whether a student graduated from any post-secondary program, even if it wasn't the one they started. The idea was to make the window long enough for completion to occur if they transferred programs or institutions, but short enough that it was also part of the same learning spell. Most commonly, we use a standard window of 6 years, but we also look to see what difference it makes when we allowed students 7 or 8 years to finish. We used available data to generate different student samples as well. The main group was almost 600,000 people who enrolled in a full-time diploma, certificate, or undergrad program at a public Ontario college or university in the fall of 2011 to 2014. We did not restrict the sample to just young people who were entering for the first time, and people could be any age. However, we did use prior enrollment data to ensure they had not attended in the previous 2 years. Also, while we only looked at people who started a program in Ontario, we followed them no matter where they went in Canada. We also constructed two other groups of students. The first was those who responded to the long form census in 2016, and the second was students who accessed federal student financial aid in their first year of study. I'm now going to jump into some of the main findings in the next several slides, and I'll have graphs that show descriptive results, although I'll point out where we found variation in the regression results. So first, let me explain what's happening in this graph. So the bars and very small percentages at the top show the rate of non-completion 6 years after entry. And then the two icons below show the corresponding 7 and 8 year rates. In the yellow bar just on the end here, we see that 1 in 3 students are non-completers by year 6, which reduces to 1 in 4 in year 7 and 8. Non-completion was highest for students who entered diploma programs, even though they're shorter, and lowest for those who entered BA programs. There was quite a bit of variation by field of study at entry, with those in education programs having the lowest non-completion rate, while those in math and computer science having the highest by year 6, although we see these rates drop considerably by year 7 and 8, which suggests that it could just take longer for them to complete their programs. When we look at the results by student attributes, we see that age of entry was particularly important. So those who are between the ages of 19 and 24 when they first entered were more likely to be non-completers. This could be people who took longer to complete high school, who required academic upgrading, or took gap years before entry. We also found that male students were more likely to be non-completers compared to females, although there was a slight reduction in this gap when examining the 7 and 8 year outcomes. This finding is pretty well documented in previous research, with some suggesting that male students tend to take a less direct pathway to their ultimate education goal. Still, it remained a sizable difference in the final 8-year regression model, even when we controlled for various other program and student factors. We also found that international students were less likely to be non-completers compared to landed immigrants or Canadian citizens. This could be due to higher tuition fees, which some people have argued engenders a stronger commitment to a program given how much has already been invested. And finally, those who received federal student aid in their first year were slightly more likely to be non-completers. However, this is not, of course, due to the funding, but rather who is identified by this indicator, mainly students who have fewer financial resources prior to entering. This next graph shows the 6-year outcome results for the census sample, and we see quite a bit of variation by race. White and Chinese students had the lowest non-completion rates, while First Nations, Black, and West Asian students had the highest. And this difference was quite substantial, often 15 to 20 percentage point differences, depending on the groups who were compared. While we don't show the results here, we also separated the analysis for males and female, and it found that some differences in non-completion rates were larger for males, while others were larger for females. What's important to point out is that these diverse student groups also vary by other axes of identity. Moving to the right of the graph, we see some small differences by home language and immigrant generation. For example, second-generation students were more likely to be non-completers compared to third-generation students. There were also major differences by activity limitations reported in 2016, mainly those who reported a physical, learning, or mental health limitation of any degree were more likely to be non-completers. And so the census asked people to self-report this information, and it could be just a slight activity limitation all the way to a more substantial one. When we looked at this, we're looking at any type of limitation reported. It's important to note that the time lag from when a student entered higher education to when they reported this information in the census means a few things could be happening here. It could be capturing students who developed a new disability and dropped out of school because of it, or ones who had one existing that persisted to 2016. This next slide explores non-completion among students who received federal student aid in their first year of study. It shows that dependent students from low-income households and single parents receiving aid had higher non-completion rates. Receiving a grant was also associated with non-completion. Importantly, the mechanism behind this association is not the grant itself, but rather the way it identifies students who face additional barriers to completion. And finally, on the very right side of this graph, we show non-completion rates by the amount of student aid received in a student's first year. And what we found is that non-completion rates did not vary considerably by the amount of aid received. So even students who required just a little aid or those who required quite a bit had fairly comparable rates of non-completion. I'm now going to switch to the labor market outcome analysis. And so first we looked at what we call the economic activity of students 1 year after leaving or graduating. On the left-hand side of this page, we show the descriptive results, while the right shows the regression-adjusted difference between non-completers and graduates. The bottom gray part of the descriptive graph shows students who remained or returned to school, which is around 40% of non-completers and 42% of graduates. And this is really quite high because we included any type of enrollment, even people who declared just a month of full or part-time study in their tax return. And the reason for doing this is we really wanted to, when we look at earnings, make sure we had a clear, definitive break between school and entering the labor market to make sure that those earnings comparisons were comparable. People who are captured as employed are shown in the dark green category, which included just over 40% of non-completers and 48% of graduates. And this analysis showed that non-completers were less likely to be captured as employed due to a higher percentage who did not file their taxes or reported zero earnings when they did file. So when we look at earnings, we found that a large first-year earning gap between graduates and non-completers. The descriptive results are shown on the left-hand side, with the earnings of graduates in light green and the earnings of non-completers in dark green. The corresponding regression results show an even larger gap once we account for other student and program factors. Here, once the model controlled for all observable factors, the earnings of non-completers were around 50% lower than graduates 1 year after leaving. We did see that the earnings gap diminishes over time when we look at 2 and 3 years post after leaving. By year 3, the earnings of non-completers were around 30% lower compared to graduates. This is a substantial difference in earnings. While we don't look at why earnings differs, it could be due to non-completers working in lower paid survival jobs or even working fewer hours. Whatever might be happening, however, these results do suggest that many non-completers had annual earnings that were under the low-income threshold. And as Catherine will talk about next, this is an important finding that was brought into the net cost phase of the project.
Thanks, Ashley. So now I'm going to talk about phase 2 of this project on the net costs of non-completion. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a brief sort of methods overview before we get into the findings, because I think that would sort of bring context to what cost-benefit analysis is doing and how we do the calculations. So cost-benefit analysis, or CBA, is a systematic approach to evaluating the total expected costs and benefits of a program, action, or activity. In CBA, there are sort of like 4 steps, and the first 2 are to identify the costs and benefits to a program. And then we would assign monetary values to these costs and benefits to calculate the cost-benefit ratio. And from this description, you can probably see that one of the challenges with CBA is that the costs and benefits can be indirect and even intangible. So it's difficult to quantify the costs and benefits, and there's not always available or exact data that latch on to what the costs and benefits are. And so what we did is to try to triangulate and check the robustness of the results through many data sources. So we used sources including the census, administrative data, as well as simulation data in order to get at the best possible estimates in this analysis. Next slide, please. And our estimation approach involves comparing the cost to benefit ratio between two groups, non-completers and completers. And in this phase of the analysis, we focus specifically on one cohort, the 2013 cohort, just to simplify the analysis to one group and to observe them throughout their lifetime. And these are students who entered a full-time undergraduate university or college program in Ontario in 2013. And non-completers were those who had not completed post-secondary 7 years later. And both the non-completion and completion scenarios were calculated relative to people who had not participated in post-secondary at all, so non-participants. So really you can think of it as like there are three groups: non-completers, completers, as well as non-participants who are the baseline of the non-completion and completion scenarios. And the difference between non-completion and completion scenarios is what we call the net cost of non-completion. And there are a couple things to keep in mind with the results that we're about to present. So first, the values are approximate and they're point estimates of the average. So they're like the average of the net cost. So they don't account for variation in individual characteristics. And we also exclude graduate students and international students in this analysis. Next slide, please, Ashley. And we evaluated the costs and benefits from perspectives of different stakeholders, which include participants, post-secondary institutions, government, and society. And from the categories here, you can see how what is a cost for one stakeholder might be a benefit for another and vice versa. And so, for example, tuition paid by a participant is a cost to them, but a benefit to the institution that receives the institution. Next slide, please, Ashley. And I'm going to illustrate our estimation approach here with like a simple example of tuition. And I'm using arbitrary numbers here just to keep things rounded and sort of more intuitive. This is more of an example rather than the actual calculation of the results that you see next. So let's say the average non-completer pays $11,000 for post-secondary tuition. And relative to a non-participant who doesn't pay any tuition because they don't attend post-secondary, there's a cost of $11,000 for scenario one. And the equivalent completer pays $20,000 for post-secondary tuition because they obviously spend more time than a non-completer in post-secondary. So relative to a non-participant, there's a cost of $20,000 for scenario two. And so then the net cost of non-completion for this tuition example is scenario one, $11,000, subtracted by scenario two, $20,000. And the difference here is $9,000. So I've been talking about this example more from the perspective of a student, right, for whom their tuition is a cost to them. So the negative $9,000 is a cost. But sorry, from the perspective of the student, the negative $9,000 is actually a benefit because the non-completing student essentially saves $9,000 of unspent tuition when they don't complete. But from the perspective of the institution, this $9,000 is a cost because they lose out on $9,000 in tuition when a student starts but does not complete post-secondary. Next slide, please. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm only presenting a summary of our results. The full report of the net cost and also the phase one study that Ashley discussed are online, and then we can drop the links into them, or I don't know if Ashley, you can do that in a second, and that those will have detailed analysis. And for the net cost analysis, it'll show the calculations by each item, like tuition, lifetime earnings, taxes paid, etc. So here we're just presenting the overall totals from a few perspectives. And this infographic illustrates the economic value of post-secondary for individuals. So compared to someone who does not attend post-secondary at all, a person who starts but does not complete post-secondary, so a non-completer, gains about $200,000 over their lifetime. Compared to someone who does not attend post-secondary at all, a person who completes post-secondary, so a completer, gains about $600,000 over their lifetime. And what this means is that when we look at the net cost between non-completers and completers, non-completing students lose out on about $380,000 in their lifetime. Next slide, please, Ashley. Similarly, when students complete post-secondary, there's significant benefits to government and society. And these potential gains, which is about $200,000 for government and $600,000 for society, are lost when students leave post-secondary without a credential. So what does this all mean? Next slide. Next slide. So as the phase one results that Ashley discussed showed, non-completers earn about 50% less than graduates when they first enter the labor market. And there are certain program and background factors associated with non-completion. And our net cost analysis shows that if we zoom to a longer horizon, for individuals, governments, and society, the decision to take up post-secondary on average is the right one, regardless of whether or not they go on to complete. But at the same time, if they can be supported to complete, there is potential for substantial return to investments for individuals, government, and society. And together, all this provides really strong justification for investing in programs that promote completion. And we think this has a lot to do with supporting student mental health. And next slide. And investing in student mental health, as I mentioned, has potential to facilitate completion. And there's some research on interventions for facilitating retention. So traditionally, we think of in-person supports such as case management, wraparound supports, peer-to-peer supports, and embedded mental health services. But there's some emerging research out there on more low-touch interventions. That might help inform earlier in-person intervention. So examples like LMS-based engagement, so reminders of deadlines, or text messaging campaigns during stressful times during the school year to remind students on available resources, to encourage students to engage with the available in-person supports. And so finally, we've invited our colleague, Nahi, here, who will talk about some of SRDC's work on supporting student mental health on campus.
Thanks, Catherine. So yeah, we thought we would briefly talk a little bit about some of the practical work that SRDC has done, some of it with CICMH with regards to supporting student mental health. So these two projects are kind of on a continuum of an earlier project and a current project that we've done, working specifically with the national standard for mental health and well-being for post-secondary students that some of you might be familiar with, that came out in October 2020. And it was developed by MHCC, the Mental Health Commission of Canada, along with the CSA group. For those of you who aren't familiar with the standard, it's kind of intended to be this like voluntary, flexible guidelines. It's an aspirational document as opposed to a prescriptive document. And it was recently renewed last year in 2025. So the first project here describes some work that SRDC did with CICMH in 2021 to work with a consortium of 5 GTA colleges to explore how to feasibly navigate and implement the standard within their campus communities. And so this we explored how mental health policy, programming, and practices align and diverge with the standard, some common strengths and challenges that the colleges were experiencing with regards to implementing the standard, and learning promising practices. And outputs from this work included, amongst other things, a toolkit and an information sheet, which can be downloaded from CICMH's website. So I'm sure if you reach out to either us or to Taryn, we can kind of share the link with you. Another output from this work was getting some feedback from the colleges on a prototype of the Campus Mental Health Action Tracker that we were just in the early stages of developing at that point, and which now exists as a free, bilingual, and fully AODA compliant online tool. So the goal of the tracker, given the aspirational nature of the standard, is to support institutions to collaborate across their campuses, their departments, because we know that there's a lot of folks across institution that's responsible for working towards student mental health. And basically, the tracker allows them to track their alignment with either the standard or other mental health framework that they might be using. So the tracker allows institutions to kind of assess their current stage of implementation, because we know that no PSI is like not doing any work around student mental health, as well as kind of track their progress towards goals that they might have for future with regards to development of like mental health policy or programs for supporting student and campus mental well-being. The tracker is split up into these 5 dimensions that are meant to map onto the guiding principles of the standard. And you can see them here. So there are student-centered practices, equity, diversity, and inclusion, knowledge-informed health promotion and reducing harm, thriving community culture of well-being, and continuous improvement. So those are the guiding principles from the standard, which are also mapped onto dimensions of the tracker, like I said. And the tracker data for tracker or institutions who are using the tracker belong to the PSIs, and they're only ever used by us at SRDC at a group level to just like report back to the funder, but we never like actually use the tracker's data. That's meant for the institutions to use themselves. And they tend to use it for a variety of purposes from what we've seen. A lot of it is for their own internal reporting purposes, whether that be to like the VP level for funding asks, or those of you who are in Ontario or Quebec, you might be familiar with Bill 166 here in Ontario and the PASM in Quebec, which both has like reporting requirements for ministries of education. So you can use the tracker to kind of output, your data that you've collected. Sorry, I'm having like throat issues apparently, for those reporting purposes. So if you're interested in learning more about the tracker, feel free to reach out to us. We can set you up with like a trial account. And kind of like the early work that we did with the GTA consortiums, we actually worked with the Mental Health Commission of Canada over the last 2 years to develop 2 new case studies. And that can be downloaded from the Mental Health Commission of Canada's website, or reach out to us and we can share the link with you. And it kind of also looks at similar things like the work with the GTA consortium of colleges. So promising practices, challenges, and how to navigate them. And the case studies we did specifically last year also explores kind of, colleges might have certain requirements, but different institutions might have like different size things that determine how well they can implement different things, and that might lead to different challenges. So yeah, the case studies explore that in a little bit more detail. And I'll pass it back over to Ashley in case you folks have questions about any of the stuff that we've presented.
Great. Yeah. So this is the part of the presentation where we open it up for questions. I see there's a few in the Q&A as well, too, that we could get started on.
Yeah, I think one of the main questions that folks are curious about is if this slide deck will be shared with attendees.
Yes, absolutely. Can I put it in the chat, or what's the best way to
If
share it?
if you're able to put it in the chat, you can, or I can upload it to the website. So I shared a link where the recording will be, and next to the recording, which says supporting content, I will have the link for the slide deck there too. So if folks want to access the slide deck there, we can do that. I can also put a link in the post-webinar email as well.
Okay, it looks like it's a little bit tricky to share it in the chat. So yeah, how about I send it to you after to upload as a way to make it more accessible online?
We can also include the links to the 2 reports, which are publicly available. So I think we can also include that too, because that will have some more detail as well if people are interested.
Perfect. I have another question here asking, is there emerging research on completion rates and cost benefit analysis for academic cohorts post-pandemic?
This is such a good question. And I mean, I think there's kind of a couple different ways to look at this. The biggest answer is no. And one of the reasons for this is because there's such a big time lag between the data we're looking at and when it's available. So the student information system, which is our main tool for tracking at least at a systems level, how students are moving through the system across public universities in Ontario, and colleges in Ontario and Canada, it has a bit of a time lag for when it's available. So usually that's about 2 years. And then the second concern is that we actually have to track them, give them enough time to complete. So if they entered during the pandemic, if we're looking at 7 or 8 years, we would just be coming to that completion sort of window of time. And then we have to look at their earnings later on. And so we have to capture that tax data. And again, there's a bit of a time lag for looking at that. So we don't have that information just yet. I think the other thing to really be mindful of is major changes that have taken place in the composition of students over this time as well, especially the I'd say like lower rates of international student enrollment over the last 3 years that I think is going to start to really influence some of the results we see in our study. In particular, we saw that international students are more likely to be completers. And so I think we might, if we did look at this post-pandemic period, there would be potentially pandemic related impacts. What does it mean when a student goes fully online virtually? And there would also be impacts of changes in the student composition as well, too. So I think it's a really good question, and I'd love to be able to repeat this research at a later point.
Thanks, Ashley. Before we get to the other questions, I'm just going to quickly put a post-webinar poll for all of you to respond, and then we'll get right back to the other questions. I'm just going to launch it, and then you all can answer it while we answer the other questions. We had this question earlier. So just to clarify, the extent of activity limitations, aka disability, including if people have multiple disabilities, were not analyzed as part of the study. If this is accurate, what is the rationale for this?
Yeah, I would say that we didn't treat these activity limitations as discrete categories. So you saw that there was, someone who might have reported a mental health limitation, someone who reported a physical disability. If they reported both of those, they would fall into both of those categories. We did not capture someone who had multiple of those disabilities, however, as a unique category on their own. We often see this in research, and I think it's a really important way to say how some of these disabilities are interrelated. Our main rationale for doing it in this way was in particular to kind of help support interpretation. Having something like a multiple disability category, we wanted to make sure that if we were going to include that, we would be treating it with, well, what kind of axes of disabilities are part of that? And so this was kind of the cleanest way for us to really, again, at this kind of high level systems level, show the variation in these. So someone could have more than one disability to be included in that category as well. So
Thank you for that. A related question. I'm wondering if there are studies that compare student completion percentages that compare those who register with accessibility services and receive accommodations and those who don't.
that's a really good question as well, too. I don't know of any off the top of my head. I could say that what we found typically is that there was a lot of studies that were institutionally specific. And these are really important for looking at the availability of services within an institution. Often this information isn't made public, or even accessible to researchers outside of the institution. So we can't look in the study to see, okay, who accessed student support, which I think would have been really important. One of the problems with looking at just an institution is that we know many students will switch between institutions. So following them over time also becomes difficult. So I think that I'm sure there are studies out there that look at this relationship between student support, even I think really important studies that look at what happens when you, and we talked a bit about this, make an intervention. So you either increase that access or you increase the publicizing access to that, and look at how that might change things like persistence or retention within the institution itself. I hope that answers your question, at least broadly.
Thank you. Another question. Did I see correctly that rates of completion were lower for math/science? And does the data take into account students who pursue trade studies?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So what we found is that if we were looking at someone who entered a math or computer science program, if we looked at the shortest window of time, so that's 6-year completion rates, they had the highest non-completion rates. But if we looked at the 7 or 8-year outcomes, they diminished quite a bit. And then it became students who were actually in service-oriented programs who had the highest non-completion rates. And so what we kind of thought more about this was that potentially they're just taking longer to complete. Non-completion rates saying that we're still high in math and computer science compared to some of our other fields of study. So it's still important to, even if they diminish over time. As for the second part of that question on apprenticeship completion, so we only looked at students who were entering college or university program at the undergraduate level, not including apprenticeship or trades. And we did allow them to transfer into that type of program. And then if they did complete it, they would be captured as a graduate. Apprenticeship completion is we've done some work on this as well too, and is a really important topic. We typically find it's quite low, and quite low across different groups as well too, and really can vary, and by trade as well. Because of apprenticeship programs and sort of how distinct they can be in comparison to a diploma or certificate or an undergraduate program, we didn't include it in this particular study. But it is a really important topic, and one in which completion rates are a persistent issue as well.
Thank you.
And I just see a quick question. What are service-oriented programs? That's a really good question. So this is we use there's sort of a national standard for categorizing fields of study, and service-oriented programs are a really wide variety of programs. They're often at the college or university level, but they can include all sorts of, sort of things like personal support workers there'll be programs that are listed in there. There can be things like areas related to like being a security, like becoming someone who's in securities. So it's often frontline services, sort of occupations in that sort of sector that will be part of that. So a really wide list of them.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm not missing any other questions. Um, I also just want to point out, folks, that Julia from HECO has shared a really helpful link if you want to find summaries of the SRDC work. I will also make sure to add these links in the web page where you'll find the recording. Did the study look at any correlation between non-completion rates and workplace integrated learning, such as co-op, internships, and placements?
We did not, although that's actually a project we're doing right now, actually to look not specifically at completion, but we're looking more at co-op and work integrated learning. So the MLP does have an indicator for students who take a co-op program. However, the notation says this indicator is inconsistent across institutions, and we don't recommend its use in Ontario. In other jurisdictions in Canada, this co-op indicator has more of a uniform way of identifying co-op across institutions, so it is more widely used. But this particular project, which we will complete over this year, is actually going to look at this in Ontario. So we'll be looking at what does this co-op indicator mean? We'll also be comparing it to the National Graduate Survey, where there's more information that students report on their work integrated learning experience while in post-secondary. Unfortunately, this data is only among graduates, however, though. So there is still this data limitation and looking at how those type of programs support persistence and potentially graduation. I think it's a good question. There's also a couple things to consider here. One is that the students who are going to take these programs, they might have a greater sense of belonging with their program, with the institution. They might also have more economic resources to be able to enter into these programs. Although some of them are paid, sometimes they can be, some students who face financial difficulties might not want to access them because they might have to quit, say, another job that supports them in their post-secondary. So there's going to be background factors on who will enter these. Where it would be very useful to look at is programs where this is a required mandate. So all students are expected to have some type of work integrated learning and understanding if that then supports students' persistence in that program, I think would be very helpful. So if anyone has any institutional data and wants to look at this in greater detail, get in touch. We'd be happy to look at this.
Thanks, Ashley. Final question I'm seeing. I don't know if I went through this one, but do the panelists have any suggestion for the role that accessibility services can play in supporting the completion percentages?
That's a really good question as well, too. It's not an area that I know a lot about. I don't know if Catherine or Nahid, if you have anything comes to mind on projects you've worked on. I will say that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
Not specifically projects that I've worked, but I used to teach undergrad, and I think accessibility services are essential to helping students who, need accommodations be able to complete their work, and even just like the in-person support. I think a lot of um, non I think some of the research on retention and non-completions, like, students slip through the cracks, right? So I think having a person who's assigned to check in on you and things like that can be helpful to make students feel attachment, as Ashley mentioned, to the institution. So I think accessibility services can provide that for students to to feel like someone is supporting them through their post-secondary journey.
And one project does come to mind for me on looking at having students enroll in accessibility services as soon as they're entered into post-secondary programs. So, and how important this can be for getting that support right away. I have like a memory of it, but I think it's an important one as well too for helping to support persistence and completion.
To add to what Catherine and Ashley have said, so I don't know how it relates. Like I don't have a project level data on like how it relates to completion, but anecdotally, both from my own teaching experience before and after COVID, I do think, yeah, providing accommodations to students makes a big difference in how likely they are to succeed and therefore complete post-secondary. I will say this, again, from my own teaching experience, but also from some of the tracker work we've done. I think a gap in this area that student success offices in general and accessibility services in particular could look at addressing is awareness among students. I think there's not necessarily not every student knows about every service that's available to them. And so there might be students slipping through the cracks just because they don't know that they can get accommodations or they don't know that they can have access to resources. So I think that's probably maybe one gap that could be addressed that's kind of come up a little bit talking to students for the tracker work, as well as just like from my own teaching experience.
Thank you for that. Well, folks, we are at the end of the webinar. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us here today. And thank you for our speakers for providing such a insightful presentation. I know a lot of us took a lot out of this. And folks, you're welcome to let us know your thoughts when the post-webinar survey pops up when you leave this meeting. In line with the topic of accessibility, our next webinar will be on concussions as June is Brain Injury Awareness Month. But again, thank you all, and make sure to keep an eye out for the email that will provide the link for the webinar recording, as well as the slide deck and all the links that you're looking for. And again, thank you to our speakers. I know a lot of folks are appreciative here, as seen in the chat. But I hope everyone has a very good day ahead, and we'll see you again next month.
Thanks so much, as well to Taryn for organizing this. Yeah, it was a real pleasure to be able to present with everyone and show this work, as well to HECO for funding this work as well.
Thank you.
Absolutely.